I walked into my father's charity gala playing the part of the struggling event planner I had allowed my family to believe I still was. I stood quietly in the corner until my stepmother snapped her fingers, summoned two armed guards, and ordered them to escort me out like a trespasser. I did not scream. I did not fight. I simply turned around and walked out into the crisp Atlanta night. What she did not know was that before the clock struck 12, I would legally seize the very hotel she was standing in, freeze her $20 million credit line, and sit in my penthouse sipping wine while my phone lit up with 67 missed calls from the family that just threw me away. By midnight, they were pounding on my mahogany doors, begging for salvation. Before I share exactly how I dismantled their fake empire piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to remind toxic relatives that you are the one holding the keys to the castle. The Grand Onyx Hotel ballroom was a masterclass in Atlanta high society excess. The air was thick with the scent of imported orchids, expensive oud fragrances, and the kind of generational wealth my father Winston desperately wanted people to believe he still possessed. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the sea of tailored tuxedos and custom silk gowns. A live jazz band played smoothly in the corner, setting the perfect rhythm for a room full of fake smiles and calculated handshakes. I stood near a massive ice sculpture near the back of the room, sipping a glass of sparkling water, simply observing the performance. At 35 years old, I had mastered the art of being invisible around my own blood. I was wearing a simple, tailored black dress, playing the role they had assigned me years ago, the struggling event planner who was just scraping by. They needed me to be the disappointment so they could shine brighter. I watched my father hold court near the center of the room, his booming laugh echoing as he shook hands with local politicians and real estate developers. He looked the part of the successful patriarch, but I knew the truth behind the tailored suit. Then there was Valerie, my stepmother. She was 55, but fought fiercely to look 30, draped in an emerald green gown that was too tight and diamonds that caught the light with every dramatic movement she made. She thrived in these environments, feeding off the attention and the perceived power of being the hostess of a highly exclusive charity gala. I watched her glide from table to table, kissing cheeks and accepting compliments that she absorbed like oxygen. I had not come to cause a scene. I had come because despite everything, Winston was still my father, and some naive, lingering part of me thought that showing up to support his supposed charitable efforts was the right thing to do. I stayed near the perimeter, avoiding the photographer and keeping to myself. But in a room where every detail was curated by Valerie to perfection, my quiet presence was apparently a flaw she could not tolerate. I saw the exact moment her eyes locked onto me. The performative smile vanished from her face, replaced by a deep, visceral sneer that I had been on the receiving end of since I was a teenager. She whispered something to a passing staff member, her manicured hand gripping her champagne flute so tightly her knuckles turned pale. Within seconds, the atmosphere shifted. The smooth jazz seemed to fade into the background as Valerie marched toward me, her heels clicking aggressively against the polished marble floor. She did not come alone. Flanking her on either side were two large, imposing security guards, their expressions serious and unyielding. I did not move. I held my glass of water, keeping my posture perfectly straight, my expression neutral. Valerie stopped 2 feet in front of me, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. She did not bother to lower her voice. In fact, she seemed to project it deliberately, wanting the audience. She raised her hand and snapped her fingers right in front of my face, a gesture so profoundly disrespectful it made my jaw clench. "Security, escort her out!" Valerie commanded, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the ballroom like a knife. The conversations at the neighboring tables sputtered and died. Heads turned, eyes widened. I looked at the guards, then back at her, maintaining absolute silence. "This is a $5,000 a plate charity gala, Imani." She continued, her tone dripping with venom and mock pity. "This is not a soup kitchen for you to network at. We cannot have you handing out your little party planning business cards and harassing our guests. You do not belong here. Leave before I have you physically removed." Before the guards could even touch my arm, Preston stepped into my personal space. My brother-in-law was a finance bro with a superiority complex, dressed in a tuxedo that probably cost more than he actually had in his bank account. He swirled his scotch, chuckling as he looked down at me. "Come on, Imani," he said, patronizing me with a wide, fake smile. "My investors are at the next table over. We are trying to secure major funding tonight, and we really cannot have you handing out your cheap business cards and cheapening the brand. It is just not a good look." Chloe, my 28-year-old stepsister, stood right beside him. She dramatically adjusted the diamond necklace hanging around her throat, letting out a loud, exaggerated sigh. "You are always embarrassing the family, Imani," she muttered, shaking her head. "Just go back to your little apartment. You are ruining my night." Valerie crossed her arms, seizing the opportunity to twist the knife deeper. "You made your choice when you moved out at 18 to hustle in the mud." She sneered, her voice carrying over the music so the surrounding guests could hear every word. "You could have worked at your father's company, but you wanted to be independent. Well, look where that got you. Still begging for scraps at a table you cannot afford to sit at. Do not come crying to us, because your little party business is failing. Now get out." I looked at the four of them, Valerie with her venom, Chloe with her entitlement, Preston with his arrogance, and my father standing less than 20 feet away. Winston had made direct eye contact with me, saw the security guards closing in on my arms, and then he simply turned his back, taking a sip of his bourbon, and returning to his conversation. That was it. The final absolute confirmation of where I stood. They were trying to shrink me. They expected tears, a public meltdown, or a desperate plea for my father to intervene. But I did not shrink. I looked directly at the two security guards who were hovering inches away. "Do not touch me," I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level. "I know the way out of my own family's event." I did not look back at Valerie. I did not spare another glance for Preston or Chloe. I turned on my heel and walked toward the grand exit, my head held high, my posture unbroken. Every step I took away from that ballroom was a step closer to their absolute ruin. The grand ballroom of the Grand Onyx Hotel felt miles away the moment the heavy brass doors closed behind me, muting the jazz band and the clinking of crystal. The grand foyer of the hotel was a stark contrast, vast and echoey, lined with marble columns and gold leaf accents. My heels clicked rhythmically against the stone. I was halfway to the valet stand when I heard heavy, urgent footsteps rushing up from behind. "Imani, wait a minute." I stopped, but I did not turn around immediately. I recognized that voice. It was the same voice that had read me bedtime stories when I was a child, the same voice that had slowly grown cold and distant the moment Valerie entered our lives. It was my father, Winston. I turned to face him. He looked out of breath, his tailored tuxedo pulling slightly at the seams. For a split second, a foolish, persistent part of my inner child hoped he had chased after me to apologize, to defend me, to act like a father. That delusion vanished the moment he opened his mouth. "You know how Valerie gets about the seating chart?" Winston said, letting out an exasperated sigh as he ran a hand over his graying beard. "She has been under a lot of stress putting this gala together. You showing up unannounced just threw her off balance. Just go home, Imani. Do not make this a bigger deal than it needs to be." I stared at him. He was not here to protect me. He was here to manage a public relations issue. "I did not show up unannounced, Winston," I replied, my voice dangerously soft. I had stopped calling him Dad a long time ago. "I purchased a ticket through the charity website. I was perfectly quiet until your wife decided to use me as a prop for her superiority complex." "Do not talk about Valerie that way," he snapped, taking a step forward. He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a sleek leather money clip. He peeled off 5 crisp $100 bills and held them out toward me. "Take this. Get yourself a nice dinner somewhere else. I will wire you a few $100 tomorrow to cover whatever expenses you have this week. Just do not ruin Chloe's big networking night with Preston's Wall Street friends. They are very important people." I looked at the crumpled bills in his outstretched hand. The sheer disrespect of it almost made me laugh. He was trying to pay me off, treating me like a nuisance, begging for a handout, completely blind to the reality of who I actually was. "Keep your money," I said, swatting his hand away gently. "I do not need your charity." Always so stubborn and proud, Winston groaned, shaking his head. This is exactly why you struggle, Imani. You always have to make things difficult. If you would just apologize to Valerie and play along, your life would be so much easier. Play along. The heat in my chest flared, but I kept my face utterly composed. You mean like how you played along when Valerie drained my entire college fund just weeks before my freshman year? Winston flinched. He hated when I brought up the past. I was 18 years old. I continued closing the distance between us, forcing him to look me in the eye. I worked 3 jobs in high school just to afford textbooks, while you let Valerie take the money my biological mother left for my education. You gave my college fund to Chloe so she could drive a brand new Porsche to her private university. You threw me out into the street with nothing telling me it builds character to hustle in the mud. Imani, that was years ago. Stop living in the past, he hissed, glancing around the empty foyer to ensure no hotel staff were listening. Valerie needed to ensure Chloe had the right image for her social circles. You were always resilient. I knew you would figure it out. And look at you, you're doing fine planning your little parties. But tonight is about high-level business. You do not understand how these things work. You are right, I replied smoothly. I do not understand how a man can stand by and watch his own flesh and blood be humiliated by a woman who married him for his bank account. A bank account that, by the way, has been running on fumes. Winston's eyes widened slightly, a flash of genuine panic crossing his features, before he masked it with arrogant bluster. I have no idea what you are talking about. Go home, Imani. Do not come back to our house until you are ready to show some respect. He turned his back on me for the second time that night, and walked back toward the ballroom doors, retreating into his fragile bubble of fake wealth and borrowed prestige. I did not feel angry anymore. I felt absolutely nothing. The last frayed string attaching me to my father snapped, and with it went any hesitation I had about destroying his world. I turned and walked through the revolving glass doors of the Grand Onyx Hotel. The crisp Atlanta night air hit my face, refreshing and sharp. The valet stand was bustling with attendants rushing to park luxury vehicles for late-arriving guests. A young valet named Jamal approached me. "Can I get your ticket, ma'am?" "No ticket needed," I said. "Just signal David." The valet nodded respectfully and spoke into his radio. A moment later, the deep guttural purr of a massive engine echoed through the circular driveway. It was not a beat-up sedan or an economy rental. Gliding smoothly to a stop right in front of me was a custom jet-black bulletproof Maybach. The tinted windows gleamed under the hotel canopy lights. My personal driver, David, stepped out in a crisp suit, giving me a sharp nod before opening the heavy rear door. From the corner of my eye, I saw the hotel's general manager, who was standing near the entrance, drop his clipboard. His jaw went slack as he recognized the vehicle, and more importantly, recognized the woman stepping into it. I slid into the plush leather seat, enveloped in the quiet luxury of the soundproof cabin. The door clicked shut, cutting off the noise of the city. I pulled my phone from my clutch and dialed a highly encrypted number. It rang exactly once. "Imani!" Elijah's deep authoritative voice came through the speaker. My corporate attorney never slept, and he was the sharpest legal mind in Atlanta. "It is time," I said, leaning back against the headrest and watching the city lights blur past the tinted glass. "Execute the clauses." "Are you absolutely sure?" Elijah asked. "Once I push this button, the entire facade comes down. They will have nothing." "They already have nothing," I corrected him. "They just do not know it yet. Winston went bankrupt 3 years ago. I am tired of letting him play pretend on my dime." It was the ultimate secret I had kept buried for 36 months. When Winston's reckless investments and Valerie's excessive spending finally caught up to them, the banks moved to foreclose on everything. To save his precious public image, Winston sought private anonymous buyers to bail him out. He thought he was dealing with a faceless overseas conglomerate. He never knew the conglomerate was me. I had taken the small event planning business I started at 19 and scaled it into a massive hospitality and real estate empire. I had quietly purchased Winston's debts. I bought his land, Through a blind trust, I even purchased the very building he was currently standing in. I was the silent owner of the Grand Onyx Hotel. I was their landlord, their bank, and their silent savior. And they had just ordered security to throw me out of my own property. Understood, Elijah said, the sound of rapid typing echoing over the line. The trust documents are unsealed. What are your immediate directives? First, I instructed, my voice devoid of any warmth. Revoke the comped venue status for tonight's charity gala. They thought they were getting the ballroom for free because of their supposed elite status. Charge them the full premium rate. Second, contact the bank. Freeze the $20 million credit line Valerie uses to fund her fake charities and designer gowns. Cut it all off. Consider it done, Elijah replied. The hotel general manager will receive the notification in approximately 2 minutes. The credit freeze is instantaneous. Thank you, Elijah. Send the audit files to my secure server. I want to see exactly what Preston has been doing with the charity money. I hung up the phone and looked out the window. The trap was set. The guillotine was falling. Back at the Grand Onyx, Valerie and Preston were likely still laughing, clinking their champagne glasses, utterly oblivious to the fact that the floor beneath them had just ceased to exist. They wanted to show me that I did not fit their tax bracket. Tonight I was going to show them they did not even belong in mine. The Maybach glided through the neon-lit streets of downtown Atlanta, slipping seamlessly into the private underground parking garage of my residential building. David opened my door and I stepped out, taking the private express elevator directly to my penthouse. When the polished steel doors parted, I stepped into my sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, a stark contrast to the cramped, unheated apartment I had rented at 18 when Winston and Valerie cut me off. I walked over to the marble kitchen island, kicked off my heels, and poured myself a generous glass of Cabernet. My phone was already vibrating silently on the counter, but I ignored it. Instead, I opened my secure laptop. Elijah was always punctual. A heavily encrypted file sat in my inbox, flagged with high priority. It was the forensic audit of Valerie's beloved charity, the organization she used to secure her status among Atlanta's elite. I took a sip of the wine, preparing myself to sift through the vanity spending I fully expected to see. I anticipated finding $50,000 floral arrangements, lavish spa weekends disguised as wellness retreats, and private jets chartered for supposed networking events. I assumed they were simply squandering money to maintain the illusion of their wealth. But as I opened the ledgers and began scrolling through the line items, the air in the room seemed to grow cold. This was not vanity spending. This was a massive, highly coordinated criminal black hole. The numbers staring back at me were staggering. Millions of dollars in supposed charitable donations had been diverted over the past 3 years. I cross-referenced the vendor payment logs. The funds were not going to the community outreach programs, the local orphanages, or the women's shelters Valerie loved to boast about in her magazine interviews. Instead, massive wire transfers were being systematically funneled into consulting fees for a firm called Apex Holdings. I opened a new tab and dug into Apex Holdings. It did not take long for my algorithms to trace the corporate registration back to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. I kept pulling the digital thread, following the money trail through layers of corporate obfuscation until the final signature footprint emerged on the offshore accounts. Preston. My arrogant finance bro brother-in-law had not been networking at the gala tonight. He had no real investors. The entire persona he projected was a complete fabrication. Preston was bleeding the charity dry. He was entirely underwater, drowning in catastrophic Wall Street losses and leveraging his father-in-law's fake charity to cover his tracks. He had been moving millions offshore just to keep his creditors from breaking his kneecaps. And Valerie was authorizing every single one of those massive wire transfers. I stared at her digital signatures on the approval forms. Why would a woman so obsessed with her own wealth actively participate in draining it? The answer was painfully obvious. Valerie was desperate to keep up the facade. She needed the world to believe that her golden child Chloe was married to a financial genius. She was willing to commit federal wire fraud just to ensure Chloe could keep driving imported sports cars and wearing diamond necklaces. They were all in on it. A house of cards built on stolen money and fragile egos. I took another sip of wine, my mind processing the sheer audacity of their scheme. But the real gut punch, the ultimate betrayal that made the breath catch in my throat, was waiting on the final page of the audit file. I opened the federal tax filings and liability documents for the charity. My eyes scanned the forms, moving past the fabricated expense reports and the falsified revenue projections. Then at the bottom of the corporate liability declaration, I saw it. A signature. My signature. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. There it was, forged with meticulous precision. The documents legally listed Imani Grant as the Chief Operations Officer and Lead Event Coordinator of the Foundation. The entire paper trail had been carefully, deliberately designed to bypass Winston and Valerie entirely. If the Internal Revenue Service or the Federal Bureau of Investigation ever audited the charity, all roads, all the missing millions, and all the offshore wire transfers led directly to me. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Throwing me out of the gala tonight had absolutely nothing to do with me wearing a simple black dress or being an embarrassment to Preston's imaginary investors. They threw me out because they needed me kept at arm's length. They needed me to look like the struggling, desperate outsider who would be perfectly positioned as their designated scapegoat. They were setting me up to be the legal fall guy when the federal agents eventually came knocking. They were not just perfectly fine with humiliating me in public, they were perfectly fine with sending me to federal prison so Chloe could keep her lifestyle. I pushed the laptop away, the screen illuminating my face in the dim light of the penthouse. I did not cry. I did not scream. The lingering trace of sadness I had felt in the hotel foyer, that tiny pathetic hope that my father might actually love me, evaporated completely. It was replaced by a cold, calculating, and absolute clarity. Earlier tonight, I was just going to ruin them financially. I was going to let them face the embarrassment of bankruptcy and eviction. But now I was going to let them burn. I picked up my phone. It was already flooded with missed calls and frantic text messages. The hotel manager had clearly delivered the bill. The $20 million credit line had been frozen. The panic was setting in at the Grand Onyx. I dialed Elijah. He answered immediately, anticipating the call. "Did you see the final pages?" he asked, his tone serious and low. "I saw them," I replied, my voice steady and ice cold. "They forged my signature on federal tax documents, Elijah. They tied my name to Preston's offshore accounts. It is federal fraud, Imani, racketeering, embezzlement, and identity theft. We have the digital footprint proving the IP addresses originated from Preston's laptop and Valerie's home office. You are completely insulated. But the moment we hand this over to the authorities, they are looking at decades in federal prison. All of them." "Good," I said, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looking down at the glittering Atlanta skyline. "Prepare the evidence binder. Everything goes to the FBI tomorrow morning. But tonight, I want to watch them realize that their designated scapegoat is the one holding the leash. They are currently experiencing a catastrophic meltdown at the venue," Elijah informed me. "The catering company packed up the food when the primary card declined. Preston's guests walked out. Your father has been trying to call the bank for the last 30 minutes, but the accounts do not belong to him anymore." "Let them panic," I said, watching a sleek black car speed down the highway far below. "They will try to find me. They always come crawling back when they run out of options." "I will be at your penthouse in 20 minutes with the security team," Elijah stated, "just in case they get desperate." "Thank you," I said, and ended the call. I set the phone back down on the marble counter. It immediately lit up with another incoming call. The caller ID flashed Winston. I watched it ring, the glowing screen reflecting off my wine glass until it went to voicemail. I was no longer the discarded daughter hustling in the mud. I was the architect of their destruction, and I had all the time in the world. The phone screen went dark, only to instantly light up again. This time the caller ID displayed Chloe, then Preston, then Valerie. A relentless, frantic digital barrage began. The silent notification counter on my screen ticked upward with satisfying speed. 10 missed calls, 30 missed calls, 67 missed calls. The text messages began flooding in a chaotic mix of confusion, entitlement, and mounting terror. Imani, why is the general manager saying you own the trust? Pick up the phone right now, Chloe demanded in a rapid-fire text. The corporate cards are declining, Preston wrote moments later. My investors are walking out of the ballroom. What did you do to the accounts? Then came a message from Valerie, her usual venom completely replaced by naked desperation. Imani, please pick up. The catering staff is packing up the food. Everyone is staring at us. Help us. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my Cabernet. The vintage was bold, rich, and tasted like absolute victory. I set my phone face down on the marble island and turned my attention back to my laptop. Through the encrypted security feeds routed directly to my network, I watched the live implosion of their fragile empire. The grand ballroom of the Grand Onyx Hotel was in total disarray. The jazz band had abruptly stopped playing, leaving an awkward, echoing silence across the room. The opulent buffet stations were being actively dismantled by the catering staff, who were carting away silver trays of lobster and caviar right in front of the bewildered guests. At the center of the room, Valerie was surrounded by a growing crowd of murmuring socialites. Her emerald gown suddenly looked cheap, her diamond necklace heavy like an iron chain, as the hotel's general manager stood firmly before her. He was flanked by the very same security guards she had unleashed on me just an hour ago. I watched Preston, his face flushed and slick with sweat, aggressively jabbing his finger at a declining credit card terminal. The Wall Street investors he had been so desperate to impress were already walking toward the exit, shaking their heads in visible disgust. Chloe was hyperventilating, frantically scrolling through her phone and desperately trying to hide behind her father. And Winston, the man who had offered me a few crumpled $100 bills in the foyer to disappear, was currently pleading with a hotel executive looking smaller and more pathetic than I had ever seen him. The illusion was shattered completely. The entire city of Atlanta was watching them drown in real time. The private elevator leading directly to my penthouse chimed softly, breaking my focus from the security feeds. The heavy steel doors parted and Elijah stepped out into my foyer, a thick manila folder tucked securely under his arm. He was flanked by two elite security guards professionals who did not flinch or speak unless spoken to. The federal authorities have the routing numbers, Elijah said, walking over to the kitchen island and setting the folder down. The Wire Fraud Task Force has already flagged the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. They are freezing Preston's remaining assets as we speak. The $20 million credit line is completely locked down. They have absolutely nothing left. And the hotel, I asked, crossing my arms. The manager handed them the bill for the gala. Elijah confirmed with a sharp nod. $250,000. When all their corporate cards declined, he gave them exactly 30 minutes to vacate the premises before he calls the local authorities for theft of services. The word is already spreading through the charity board. Valerie's reputation is completely dust. I nodded, adjusting the cuffs of my simple black dress. The same dress they claimed was not good enough for their tax bracket. Are they on their way up here? Elijah checked his encrypted smartwatch. They bypassed the lobby security by tailgating a resident into the parking garage. They are currently in the freight elevator heading up to this floor. They should be at your door in exactly 2 minutes. I took a deep breath, the cold clarity of the moment washing over me. I had spent my entire life being pushed aside, minimized, and treated as an inconvenient secret. They had stolen my biological mother's legacy to fund their vanity, and then tried to frame me for federal embezzlement to cover their own spectacular incompetence. Tonight was the end of the line. The heavy rhythmic pounding echoed through the penthouse. It was not a polite knock. It was the desperate, frantic hammering of people who had just realized they were standing on a trapdoor. Imani opened the door. Imani, please. Winston's voice was muffled through the thick mahogany, completely stripped of its usual arrogant authority. Let us in, you have to let us in. Valerie cried out, her voice shrill and unhinged. I nodded to the two security guards. They positioned themselves on either side of the entrance, their stances wide and imposing. Elijah stood just behind me, a silent, lethal presence, armed with indisputable evidence. I walked slowly toward the door. I did not rush. I let them pound against the wood for a few more seconds, letting the harsh reality of their helplessness truly sink in. Then, with a smooth, effortless motion, I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the double mahogany doors open. Winston practically fell forward into the entryway, his expensive tuxedo disheveled, his breathing ragged. Valerie was right behind him, mascara running down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines. Chloe looked terrified, clutching her designer purse like a shield, while Preston remained near the back of the group, his eyes darting nervously toward the armed guards flanking my doorway. Imani, thank God, Winston gasped, reaching a trembling hand out toward me. I did not move an inch, and my expression remained completely stoic. He quickly dropped his hand. There has been a massive mistake at the hotel. The manager is claiming that a blind trust revoked our sponsorship and they froze all of Valerie's charity accounts. The bank is saying you are the trustee. You have to call them and clear this up right now. There is no mistake, Winston, I said, my voice cutting through their panic like a freshly sharpened blade. I own the Grand Onyx Hotel. I own the land it sits on. I bought your bankrupt estate 3 years ago when you were too busy bleeding your finances dry to maintain your fake image. The trust belongs to me, and I am the one who froze the accounts. Valerie let out a choked gasp, stepping forward. You did this to us. You ruined my gala. Imani, we are family. You cannot just cut us off. People are laughing at us downstairs. My reputation is ruined. Your reputation was built on stolen money, I replied coldly. You drained my college fund to buy Chloe a sports car. You told me to hustle in the mud, so I did exactly that. I built an empire in the mud while you built a fragile house of cards. And now the wind is blowing. Preston tried to puff out his chest, stepping past Chloe with a faux aggressive glare. Listen to me, you little party planner. You are going to unlock those accounts right now, or I am going to sue you for everything you are worth. You cannot just hijack a federally recognized charity. I did not even look at him. I simply nodded to Elijah. My attorney stepped forward, his presence commanding absolute silence. He dropped the thick, heavy manila folder directly onto the hardwood floor at Preston's feet. The papers spilled out, exposing bank statements, offshore routing numbers, and falsified tax declarations. Apex Holdings. Elijah said, his voice deep and resonant. A Cayman Islands shell corporation. $3 million diverted from the charity into your personal accounts to cover catastrophic market losses. And to make matters worse, you and Valerie forged Imani's signature as the chief operations officer to make her the legal fall guy for your embezzlement. Preston's face drained of all color. He looked at the papers scattered on the floor, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The arrogant finance bro had completely vanished, replaced by a terrified criminal who realized he had just walked directly into a steel trap. You tried to send me to federal prison so you could maintain your luxury lifestyle, I said, finally locking eyes with Preston. The FBI already has this entire folder. They have your routing numbers, and they are reviewing the forged signatures. You are not going to sue me, Preston. You are going to federal prison. Chloe let out a piercing scream, grabbing Preston's arm. Is this true? Tell me this is not true. He did not answer her. He just stared at the floor, visibly shaking. Winston dropped to his knees right there in my entryway. The proud patriarch, the man who had patronized me and dismissed me my entire life, was now weeping at my feet. Imani, please, he begged, his hands clasped together. I am your father. I did not know about the forgery. I swear I did not know. Do not do this to us. You are going to leave us with nothing. I looked down at the man who had watched security guards grab my arms just hours prior. I felt no pity. I felt absolutely nothing but the profound, liberating weight of justice. You threw me out tonight because I did not fit your aesthetic, I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. Now you do not fit my tax bracket. The 20 million is permanently frozen. The authorities have the evidence. You have exactly 30 days to vacate my properties before I have you officially evicted. Imani, please, we have nowhere to go, Valerie sobbed, reaching out toward my dress. I took a deliberate step back out of her reach. I looked my father dead in the eye, offering him the exact same coldness he had given me in the hotel foyer. Security, I commanded, echoing the very words that started this entire night. Escort them out. The two guards stepped forward immediately, placing firm hands on Winston and Preston. The family that had treated me like dirt was forcibly turned around and marched back toward the freight elevator. I did not wait to watch them leave. I reached out and pulled the heavy mahogany doors shut. The lock clicked into place with a satisfying definitive snap, leaving me in absolute wealthy peace. The polished marble of the grand lobby clicked beneath my heels as I walked away from the ballroom. The heavy gold-plated doors had closed behind me, cutting off the jazz band and the suffocating scent of Valerie's expensive perfume, but the silence of the foyer offered no peace. I could hear Winston's heavy, frantic footsteps rushing across the floor, desperately trying to catch up to me before I reached the main exit. I did not speed up. I did not run. I let him chase me, knowing this would be the last time he ever had the chance. "Imani, be reasonable," Winston hissed, grabbing my upper arm to force me to stop. I looked down at his hand gripping my skin, then slowly raised my eyes to meet his. My gaze was so hollow, so entirely void of whatever daughterly submission he expected, that he immediately let go. He took a half-step back, smoothing his tuxedo jacket, trying to recover his patriarchal authority. "You are making a scene over nothing," he said, lowering his voice and glancing nervously at a passing bellhop. "Valerie has been under immense pressure planning this charity event. She wanted everything to be flawless for Preston and his colleagues. You showing up unannounced in that simple dress just threw her off. Go home. I will wire you a few $100s tomorrow to cover your week. Just do not ruin Chloe's night." I stared at him, letting his words hang in the chilled air, conditioned air of the lobby. He was offering me pocket change to disappear. He was asking me to swallow my pride, accept public humiliation, and fade into the background so his new wife and entitled stepdaughter could play pretend with Atlanta's elite. "You think this is about a dress, Winston?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly measured. "You think this is about me wanting to crash a party? You always have to be so stubborn," he groaned, dragging a hand across his face. "You always have to hold on to this anger. If you would just apologize and play along, your life would be so much easier. You have always made things unnecessarily hard for yourself." "Play along," I repeated, feeling a familiar burning heat rise in my chest. The kind of heat I had spent 17 years learning to control. "You want me to play along just like you did when Valerie drained my entire college fund?" Winston stiffened. His jaw clenched and his eyes darted away from mine. He hated when I brought up the past, mostly because the past was a mirror that showed him exactly what kind of man he truly was. I was 18 years old. I continued stepping closer to him, refusing to let him look away. I had worked 3 jobs in high school just to afford test prep materials. I earned my acceptance letters. And 2 weeks before my tuition was due, I went to the bank to check the account my biological mother had set up for me before she died. The account you were supposed to be guarding. It was empty. Every single dime my mother had saved for my future was gone. "Imani, we have talked about this," he muttered defensively, crossing his arms. "We have never talked about it," I corrected him sharply. "You dictated, and I survived. I walked back into your house that day, terrified and hyperventilating, only to find Valerie standing in the driveway. She was laughing, tossing a set of keys to Chloe. A brand new custom-ordered Porsche for high school graduation. Hi. The memory hit me so viscerally, I could almost smell the exhaust fumes of that sports car. I remembered standing on the pavement, clutching my useless acceptance letters, while Chloe shrieked with joy and hugged Valerie. I remembered looking at Winston, begging him to tell me there was a mistake, begging him to tell me my mother's money had not just been handed to his stepdaughter for a vanity purchase. And I remember exactly what he said to me that day. "You told me Chloe needed a reliable vehicle for her image at her private university," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper that echoed in the empty lobby. "You looked me in the eye and told me that I was smart, that I was resilient, and that I could easily secure student loans to figure it out. You said it built character to hustle in the mud. You let your new wife steal my dead mother's legacy to buy a luxury car, and you threw me out into the street with nothing. It was a strategic family decision. Winston fired back, his tone defensive and arrogant. Valerie needed to ensure Chloe had the right social standing for her network. You were always tough, Imani. I knew you would survive, and look at you now. You are doing fine planning your little parties and events. You figured it out just like I said you would. He actually believed his own narrative. He genuinely believed that his betrayal was a form of tough love rather than a cowardly capitulation to a greedy woman. He felt no remorse for stealing my future because in his eyes, I had managed to survive the theft. You need to stop living in the past, Imani, Winston said, pointing a finger at me as if delivering a final authoritative ruling. What happened 17 years ago is over. You carrying this grudge is exactly why you do not fit in with this family anymore. Let it go. Stop being bitter, take the money I am offering you tomorrow and go home. Stop living in the past. Those 5 words hung suspended between us. For 17 years I had harbored a tiny, pathetic ember of hope that one day my father would wake up, realize the magnitude of his betrayal, and apologize. I had spent my entire adult life building my empire in absolute silence, waiting for the day he would finally see me, protect me, and choose me. But looking at his annoyed, impatient face under the crystal chandelier of the Grand Onyx Hotel, that ember finally extinguished. There would be no redemption for him. He was not a victim of Valerie's manipulation. He was an active, willing participant. He was a man who would gladly feed his own daughter to the wolves if it meant keeping his house quiet and his aesthetic intact. That realization did not break my heart. It freed my soul. My father was dead to me. The man standing in front of me was just another bad investment that needed to be liquidated. You are absolutely right, Winston, I said, the tension completely draining from my shoulders. The past is over. I am not angry anymore. In fact, I am incredibly grateful. He frowned clearly, thrown off by my sudden shift in demeanor. Grateful for what? Grateful that you showed me exactly who you are, I replied, smoothly adjusting the strap of my clutch. Because if you had been even a fraction of a decent father, I might have felt bad about what happens next. What are you talking about? He asked, his brow furrowing with irritation. I told you I will send you some money tomorrow. Keep your money, Winston. You are going to need every single cent of it. I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on him for the final time and walked confidently toward the heavy glass exit doors. I could feel his confused, arrogant gaze burning into my back, but I did not falter. The time for arguing in lobbies was over. The time for execution had arrived. The crisp Atlanta night air hit my face the second I stepped through the revolving glass doors of the Grand Onyx Hotel. It was refreshing, sharp, and biting, a welcome contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of fake wealth and cheap perfume I had just left behind in the lobby. I took a deep, stabilizing breath, letting the cool wind clear my lungs. If Valerie and Winston were peering through the tinted glass of the ballroom windows, they probably expected to see me shivering on the curb. In their arrogant, narrow minds, they likely pictured me pulling up a ride-sharing app on a cracked phone screen, or worse, walking 3 blocks in my sensible black heels to catch the late-night train back to whatever cramped apartment they assumed I lived in. They needed to imagine me struggling. It was the only way they could validate their own hollow existence. But I was not struggling. I had not struggled in a very long time. I walked past the long line of guests waiting for their luxury sedans and rented sports cars. The valet stand was a chaotic swarm of shouting attendants and impatient socialites, but I did not stop at the back of the line. I bypassed the velvet ropes and walked directly up to the head valet, a sharp-eyed young man named Marcus, who had been working at this hotel for 5 years. I did not hand him a crumpled paper ticket. I simply made eye contact and gave him a single subtle nod. Marcus immediately stood up straighter. He tapped his earpiece, turned his back to the shouting guests, and spoke a rapid command into his radio. Less than 30 seconds later, the low, guttural purr of a massive engine vibrated through the circular driveway. It drowned out the chatter of the crowd and the distant sounds of city traffic. Gliding smoothly out of the VIP underground staging area was my vehicle. It was a custom jet black bulletproof Maybach. The paint was so immaculately polished it looked like liquid obsidian under the canopy lights. The windows were tinted so heavily they absorbed the light, hiding the passenger cabin in absolute secrecy. The crowd of Atlanta elites standing at the valet stand fell entirely silent. Conversations sputtered and died. Even the most arrogant men in the crowd, the ones who had just been inside drinking Preston's expensive scotch, turned to stare at the machine rolling to a halt right in front of me. The driver's side door opened and David stepped out. David was not just a chauffeur. He was a former military security contractor I paid a premium to keep me safe and insulated from the world. He wore a crisp, tailored charcoal suit, his posture rigid and professional. He walked around the front of the massive vehicle, his eyes scanning the crowd with practiced efficiency before he pulled open the heavy armored rear door for me. From the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement near the hotel entrance. The general manager of the Grand Onyx, a meticulous man who obsessed over VIP clientele, had just stepped outside to assist a high-profile guest. He froze when he saw the Maybach. Then his eyes shifted to the woman stepping into it. I saw the exact moment the realization hit him. The blood drained from his face. His jaw went slack. He knew who owned that specific vehicle because he had been briefed on the security protocols for the anonymous owner of the building. He was looking at the woman who signed his paychecks, the woman who owned the very marble he was standing on, and he knew that his security team had just been ordered to throw me out. I did not give him a second glance. I did not offer him a reassuring smile or a nod of acknowledgement. I slid into the plush temperature-controlled leather seat of the Maybach. David closed the heavy armored door behind me, and the heavy thud sealed off the outside world completely. The transition was instantaneous. The noise of the city, the murmurs of the crowd, the lingering sting of my father's rejection, it all vanished. The cabin of the Maybach was perfectly soundproofed. It smelled of rich leather and the subtle, clean scent of the custom detailing. I leaned back against the headrest and closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. I waited for the grief to hit me. I waited for the tears that a daughter was supposed to shed when her father finally definitively chose his toxic wife over his own flesh and blood. I waited for the heartbreak of realizing that my family was truly gone. But the tears never came. The grief did not materialize. Instead, a profound, absolute sense of detachment washed over me. It was surgical and cold. The struggling event planner persona I had worn for the last 3 hours shed from my skin like a cheap coat. I was no longer Imani, the discarded daughter. I was Imani Grant, the sole proprietor of a multi-million-dollar real estate and hospitality empire, and I was about to go to war. I opened my eyes, the cold clarity of my purpose sharpening my focus. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. It was not a standard device. It was a secure encrypted mobile line I used strictly for high-level corporate communications. I pulled up a single contact and pressed dial. The line did not even ring a full time before the call connected. Elijah answered with his signature deep, resonant voice. He was my lead corporate attorney, a brilliant, ruthless legal mind who had spent the last 3 years meticulously constructing the financial trap my family was currently standing on. He never slept, and he had been waiting for this specific phone call all night. "Is the gala over?" Elijah asked, his tone perfectly professional, but carrying a subtle undercurrent of anticipation. "The gala is just getting started," I replied, staring out the tinted window as David steered the Maybach onto the glowing downtown expressway. "But my attendance is no longer required." Valerie made sure of that. She had security escort me out. Winston supervised the exit. A heavy, dangerous silence hung on the line for a moment. Elijah knew exactly what my father had done to me in the past. He knew about the stolen college fund, the years of gaslighting, and the sheer financial incompetence that had driven Winston into secret bankruptcy. He had helped me buy up their debts quietly, strategically, waiting for the day they finally pushed me too far. "They threw you out of your own hotel," Elijah stated, presenting the fact with a chilling precision. "They threw out the struggling party planner," I corrected him smoothly. "They have no idea who actually owns the deed to the ground they are dancing on. But it is time to formally introduce them." I looked down at the glowing screen of my phone, the digital connection to the man who held the keys to my legal arsenal. I felt no hesitation. There was no lingering loyalty to stay my hand. Winston had made his choice in the lobby. He chose to protect his wife's fragile aesthetic over his daughter's dignity. Now he was going to pay the ultimate price for that aesthetic. Elijah, I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the absolute authority of a woman who was about to dismantle a legacy. It is time. Execute the clauses. Bring it all down. The confirmation from Elijah came with the swift and rhythmic tapping of his keyboard over our secure line. I leaned my head against the cool leather of the Maybach seat and listened to the sound of my empire shifting from the shadows into the blinding light of day. For 3 years I had operated in total silence. I had allowed my family to view me as a minor character in their grand delusional play. Tonight the curtain was dropping on their entire production. "The shell is dissolving right now, Imani," Elijah said, his voice carrying the sharp precision of a predator closing in on its prey. "The blind trust is officially unsealed. Ownership of the Grand Onyx Hotel, the surrounding commercial acreage, and the entirety of Winston Grant's consolidated debt portfolio are currently propagating across the municipal databases. As of this exact second, there is no faceless overseas conglomerate shielding them. Every deed, every loan, and every property title is publicly registered under your name." "Excellent," I replied. My gaze locked on the towering skyscrapers of downtown Atlanta as my driver navigated the sleek vehicle through the night. Let the records show exactly who holds the leash. It was the ultimate irony. My father had spent my entire life lecturing me about success. He loved to stand at the head of a mahogany dining table and boast about building a legacy, about the importance of generational wealth, and about how my decision to leave his house to start a small event planning business was a catastrophic mistake. He loved to remind me that I lacked the business acumen to survive in the real world. But Winston did not just make bad parenting choices, he made catastrophic business ones. 3 years ago, the illusion of his wealth had collided violently with reality. Winston was a man who prioritized keeping up appearances above all else. He was terrified of looking small in front of his wealthy peers, and he was even more terrified of disappointing Valerie. My stepmother demanded a lifestyle that required a bottomless bank account. She wanted European vacations, custom designer wardrobes, and lavish parties to secure her status among the city elite. She also demanded that Winston fund Chloe's exorbitant lifestyle, pouring money into luxury cars and high-end apartments so her daughter could attract a wealthy husband. To fund that endless vanity, Winston started borrowing against his own assets. He took out massive high-interest commercial loans, leveraging his company, his land, and his primary investments. He even let Preston, his arrogant new son-in-law, convince him to move significant capital into highly volatile portfolios. When the market shifted, Winston's financial foundation crumbled overnight. The banks called in the loans. He was weeks away from federal foreclosure, asset seizure, and absolute public ruin. He was sweating through his tailored suits, secretly begging creditors for extensions and desperately trying to hide the collapse from Valerie and his country club friends. That was when my financial analyst flagged his impending bankruptcy. By that time, I was no longer just an event planner. I had taken the grueling, exhausting years of hustling in the mud and transformed my small business into a massive corporate hospitality and real estate empire. I owned luxury venues across the eastern seaboard. I managed high-yield commercial portfolios. I was generating wealth that Winston could not even comprehend, and I did it all while letting him believe I was still struggling to pay rent. When I saw the foreclosure notices threatening to wipe out my father, I had a choice. I could have watched him fall. I could have let the banks tear his fake legacy to shreds and let Valerie experience the poverty she so deeply despised. But I chose a different route. I chose absolute control. I instructed Elijah to establish a blind trust under the name Onyx Holdings. Operating entirely behind the scenes, I stepped in and bought out every single one of Winston's debts. I paid off the aggressive creditors. I bought the commercial land beneath his corporate headquarters. And most importantly, I purchased the Grand Onyx Hotel outright, securing the deed to the very property Valerie used as her personal playground. I became the bank. I became their landlord. Winston was so desperate to save his pride that he did not even look closely at the paperwork. He happily signed the restructuring agreements, believing that a mysterious foreign investment group had bailed him out simply to acquire prime Atlanta real estate. He thought he had outsmarted the system. He thought he was still a titan of industry. He never realized he was signing his entire life over to the daughter he had discarded. I let them live the illusion for 3 years. I let Valerie host her fake charity galas in my ballroom. I let Chloe drive cars parked in garages I technically owned. I let Winston sit at the head of the table and talk down to me, offering me scraps of advice while I held the mortgage to his entire existence. Why did I do it? It was not out of mercy, it was a test. I wanted to see if the removal of financial pressure would make him a better man. I gave him a silent gift of grace, waiting to see if he would finally look at me and see a daughter instead of a failure. I wanted to see if he would ever protect me from Valerie's relentless cruelty, or if he would finally put Preston in his place for disrespecting me. Tonight he failed the test completely and permanently. When he stood in the foyer of the Grand Onyx Hotel and offered me a few crumpled $100 bills to disappear, he sealed his own fate. When he told me to go home so I would not ruin his stepdaughter's networking event, he proved that he was a coward who would always prioritize a comfortable lie over an inconvenient truth. He chose to throw me out of my own building to appease a woman who was actively draining his non-existent bank accounts. Are the local tax authorities updated? I asked Elijah, shifting in the plush leather seat as the Maybach merged onto the highway. Fully updated, Elijah confirmed. The county registrar reflects Imani Grant as the sole proprietor of the Grand Onyx Hotel and all associated properties. Winston Grant is currently listed as an unsecured tenant with zero equity. If he tries to pull a line of credit against the property tomorrow morning, the system will flag him for fraud. Perfect, I murmured, a cold satisfaction settling deep in my chest. For years I had swallowed my pride. I had bitten my tongue while Valerie paraded around in diamonds bought with my silent charity. I had listened to Chloe complain about my aesthetic, completely unaware that the ground she walked on belonged to me. I had endured Preston's condescending lectures about wealth, knowing full well he was nothing more than a parasite feeding off a dying host. I had been the architect of their survival, and they had repaid me by treating me like a disease they needed to eradicate from their pristine social circle. They wanted to play games with high society. They wanted to prove that they were the apex predators in the room. But they had forgotten the most important rule of the jungle. You never attack the person who built the cage. I looked at the glowing screen of my phone, waiting for the first sign that the shockwave had hit the ballroom. The unsealing of the blind trust was just the opening move. It was the swift, brutal removal of the ground beneath their feet. Winston thought he was a powerful man, commanding security guards to remove a nuisance. He was about to find out he was nothing more than a squatter who had just evicted his own landlord. The silence in the car was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the tires against the asphalt. I took a deep breath, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of my childhood finally lifting from my shoulders. The girl who had begged for her father's love was gone. The woman who replaced her owned the entire board, and she was done playing nice. I leaned closer to the speaker system embedded in the plush leather of the Maybach, my voice dropping into a register of absolute surgical precision. I was done admiring the trap from a distance. It was time to spring it. Elijah, I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the distant, illuminated peak of the Grand Onyx Hotel. I want to start with the ballroom. Valerie has been running her high society events out of my property for 3 years, completely free of charge. She genuinely believes her husband's handshake and undeniable charm secure that space. She thinks she is the queen of Atlanta elite because she gets a premier venue comped on demand. I can see the active event folio in the hotel management system right now. Elijah replied, the rapid clicking of his keyboard echoing over the encrypted line. The system currently lists the charity gala under a 100% sponsorship waiver approved by Winston Grant. Revoke the waiver immediately, I instructed without a single shred of hesitation. Reclassify the gala as a private premium corporate rental. Understood, Elijah said smoothly. What rate are we applying to the master ledger? The absolute maximum, I commanded. Charge them for the ballroom rental. Charge them for every single plate of imported caviar, every bottle of vintage champagne, and every hour that jazz band plays on the stage. Add in the cost of the valet service, the custom ice sculptures, and the excessive floral arrangements Valerie demanded. And make absolutely sure you bill them a premium hazard rate for the 2 security guards who just escorted me out of the lobby. I want every single dime accounted for and billed directly to Winston Grant. It is done, Elijah confirmed. The hotel billing system is updating as we speak. The final invoice for the evening is currently calculating at exactly $250,000. The system is generating an immediate payment due notification for the general manager. A sharp, satisfying thrill radiated through my chest. For years, Valerie had weaponized her access to luxury to make me feel small. She had mocked my early struggles, turning her nose up at the tiny apartment I lived in while I was building my empire. She threw me out tonight because she believed my presence cheapened her aesthetic. She was about to learn that her entire aesthetic was a rental and the lease had just expired. Now for the main artery, I continued feeling the heavy weight of total control settling over me. Let us talk about the $20 million revolving credit line. This was the core of Winston and Valerie's entire illusion. 3 years ago, when Winston was desperately trying to avoid public bankruptcy, he leveraged the hotel and the surrounding commercial acreage to secure a massive credit line. Because I had secretly bought his debt and the property deeds through the blind trust, that credit line was technically collateralized by my assets. Winston thought he had outsmarted the banks. Valerie thought she had an endless supply of liquid cash to fund her designer gowns, her lavish vacations, and her supposedly philanthropic charities. I have the banking portal open through our primary financial institution, Elijah stated, his tone shifting into pure corporate ruthlessness. The primary account is active. I see 4 black corporate cards linked directly to the $20 million limit. 2 are registered to Winston, 1 is registered to Valerie, and 1 is registered to Preston. My jaw tightened at the mention of my brother-in-law. Preston swaggered around the city, pretending to be a self-made finance genius, tossing his corporate card on tables to impress his equally arrogant friends. He had stood in the ballroom tonight, swirling his scotch, telling me I was bad for his brand. The fact that he was carrying a card funded by my equity made my blood boil. Freeze it. I ordered my tone, leaving absolutely no room for debate. Freeze the entire line. Elijah did not hesitate. I am executing the hard freeze protocol now, initiating the total asset lock. Do not just lock the primary account. I added my mind, moving 2 steps ahead. Shut down every single secondary card attached to that portfolio. Cancel the authorizations, block the routing numbers, strip their digital access to the banking app. I do not want them to be able to buy a pack of gum using my equity. I want the cards to decline instantly, loudly and publicly. The keystrokes over the speakerphone sped up, sounding like nails hammering into a coffin. The freeze is fully executed, Elijah confirmed a moment later. The $20 million credit line is permanently suspended. The bank has flagged the accounts due to a total loss of underlying collateral. Winston, Valerie, and Preston just had their financial lifelines severed. If they attempt to swipe any of those corporate cards right now, the terminal will instantly reject the transaction with a code for fraudulent activity. I leaned back against the headrest, letting the reality of those words sink in. My stepmother had spent the last decade building a fortress of arrogance, shielding herself with money that never belonged to her. She used that shield to terrorize me, to manipulate my father, and to elevate her spoiled daughter. Tonight, she was standing in a ballroom surrounded by the wealthiest people in Atlanta, completely unaware that her shield had just evaporated into thin air. I pictured the scene playing out inside the Grand Onyx Hotel. The general manager, a man who built his career on serving VIP clients with flawless precision, was currently staring at his computer screen. He was watching the system overwrite Winston Grant's sponsorship status. He was printing out a $250,000 invoice. He was realizing that the people hosting the gala were no longer the owners of the building, but rather severely delinquent tenants. Has the general manager received the notification? I asked, watching the city lights reflect off the polished mahogany trim of the Maybach interior. The alert was successfully delivered to his terminal 1 minute ago, Elijah replied. He is required by standard hotel operating procedure to secure a valid form of payment immediately when a sponsorship waiver is revoked during a live event. He has no choice but to confront them. Let me know the second you receive the forensic audit from the charity accounts, I said, preparing to transition to the next phase of the demolition. I want to see exactly what Preston has been doing with Valerie's so-called philanthropic funds before they inevitably come crawling to my door. The audit is already rendering on my end, Elijah stated. I will transmit it to your secure server before you reach the penthouse. Prepare yourself, Imani. If Preston has been utilizing a card tied to this account, the damage is going to be extensive. Send it, I commanded. And Elijah. Yes, Imani. Make sure hotel security is on standby, I said, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. When those credit cards decline, Winston is going to throw a tantrum. I want my property protected. Consider it handled, he replied, ending the call. I lowered my phone and stared out the tinted window. The trap was sprung. The power was cut. The artificial life support keeping my family's reputation breathing had been abruptly unplugged. I sat in the absolute silence of my vehicle, riding through the city I had conquered, waiting for the inevitable explosion. I tapped the screen of my tablet, bringing up the live high-definition security feeds from the Grand Onyx Hotel. My finger hovered over camera 4, which offered a perfect unobstructed view of the main VIP table at the center of the ballroom. I bypassed the standard video feed and enabled the localized audio routing the sound directly through the pristine speakers of the Maybach. There they were, my family basking in the artificial glow of their stolen prestige. Valerie was practically glowing. She sat at the center of the table, a crystal champagne flute balanced delicately between her manicured fingers. She was laughing loudly at a joke made by a prominent local politician, her head thrown back in a display of absolute victorious arrogance. The adrenaline of throwing me out of the gala had clearly intoxicated her. She looked around the room like a queen surveying her kingdom, completely convinced that she had just eliminated the only stain on her perfect evening. Winston sat beside her, looking every bit the proud patriarch. He was leaning back in his velvet chair, nodding along to whatever lies Preston was feeding the two wealthy investors seated across from them. Chloe was busy taking photos of herself, ensuring the diamond necklace Winston could not actually afford caught the light for her social media followers. They looked untouchable. They looked perfect. Then Harrison stepped into the frame. Harrison was the general manager of the Grand Onyx, a man with 20 years of experience in luxury hospitality. He was usually the picture of relaxed confidence, a master at anticipating the needs of elite guests before they even had to ask. But right now, as he walked across the ballroom floor toward the VIP table, Harrison looked like a man marching toward a firing squad. His posture was rigid. A light sheen of sweat gathered on his forehead. In his hands, he carried a sleek black leather billing folio. I leaned forward in my seat, my eyes locked on the screen, listening intently. Harrison reached the table. He stood there for a moment, waiting to be acknowledged, but Winston simply ignored him, continuing his conversation with the investors. Harrison cleared his throat, shifting his weight slightly. "Excuse me, Mr. Grant," Harrison said, his voice tight but professional. "I apologize for the interruption, but we have an urgent administrative matter that requires your immediate attention." Winston did not even look up. He waved his hand in a dismissive, arrogant gesture. "Not now, Harrison. Can you not see we are entertaining guests? Put it on my tab and handle it tomorrow," Sir Harrison insisted, taking a step closer. The music in the ballroom seemed to dip perfectly at that moment, making his voice carry further than intended. "This cannot wait until tomorrow." Valerie finally turned her attention to the general manager. Her smile vanished, replaced by the same venomous sneer she had aimed at me an hour earlier. "Harrison, what on earth is wrong with you?" She snapped, her voice dripping with condescension. "You are interrupting a highly sensitive networking event. Whatever trivial issue you have, take it up with my assistant." Harrison stood his ground. He took a deep breath, clutching the leather folio tightly. "Ma'am, you no longer have a corporate tab with this hotel. The master sponsorship waiver for this evening has just been revoked." Winston finally stopped talking. He slowly turned his head, his brow furrowing into a dark, threatening scowl. What are you talking about? Winston demanded, his voice low and dangerous. I am the sponsor. I am the owner of this estate. I authorize the waivers. You work for me. Actually, sir, you do not own this estate, Harrison replied, his voice shaking slightly but holding firm. The hotel management system just received a direct override from the primary stakeholder. The blind trust holding your corporate debt has been unsealed. The true owner of Onyx Holdings has assumed direct active control of the property. I have been given strict non-negotiable orders to reclassify this entire charity gala as a premium private rental. The silence at the table was sudden and absolute. The two investors Preston had been courting stopped drinking their scotch. Chloe lowered her phone, her mouth hanging slightly open. Valerie let out a sharp, mocking laugh, looking around the table as if Harrison had just told a terrible joke. This is absurd, she scoffed. Winston, fire this man immediately. He is clearly having a breakdown. I cannot be fired by you, ma'am, Harrison stated flatly. He opened the black leather folio and placed it directly in the center of the table, right on top of the imported silk tablecloth. Because your sponsorship has been voided during a live event, standard operating procedure requires me to secure a valid form of payment for services rendered. The total for the ballroom rental, the catering, the staff, and the damages is $250,000. It is due immediately. Winston stared at the invoice inside the folio. The color began to drain from his face as the sheer magnitude of the number registered. He looked up at Harrison, his chest heaving with sudden, barely suppressed rage. You think you can embarrass me in front of my guests? Winston growled, slamming his fist onto the table so hard the silverware rattled. I do not know what kind of technical glitch your system is having, but I am going to make sure you never work in this city again. You want payment? Fine. Winston reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out his heavy metal corporate card. He threw it onto the folio with a loud clack. Run the card. Run it right now and then get out of my sight before I call security to drag you out. Harrison did not argue. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a mobile payment terminal. He picked up the black card, inserted the chip, and typed in the massive total. I watched the screen of my tablet, my heart beating with a steady, triumphant rhythm. I knew exactly what was about to happen. The terminal processed for 3 agonizing seconds. Then a loud, sharp, aggressive beep echoed from the machine. Declined, Harrison said, reading the bright red text on the small screen. Winston froze. Try it again, he ordered, his voice losing a fraction of its arrogant edge. Harrison ran the card a second time. Another loud, unforgiving beep. Declined, sir. The system is stating the account is frozen. Valerie gasped, her hand flying to her chest. She dug frantically into her designer clutch and pulled out her own matching corporate card. Use mine, she demanded, her voice pitching up in panic. It is a bank error. Just use mine. Harrison took her card and inserted it into the machine. Beep. Declined. The panic at the table became palpable. The investors were openly staring now, exchanging uncomfortable glances. Preston, realizing that his entire facade of wealth was crumbling in front of the very men he needed to impress, jumped up from his chair. Give me the machine, Preston barked, pulling out his own wallet. You people are incompetent. I will cover it. He slapped his card against the contactless reader, trying to look like the wealthy savior of the family. Beep. Declined. Harrison looked at the group, his initial terror entirely replaced by professional detachment. Every card linked to your portfolio is returning a hard freeze code, he informed them. The bank has locked your accounts. Winston stood up his chair, scraping violently against the floor. This is impossible. I have $20 million in that credit line. Get the bank on the phone right now. I already spoke to the bank, Mr. Grant Harrison replied, stepping back to avoid Winston's looming presence. The bank confirmed the freeze was authorized by the new property owner. Your collateral is gone. Chloe let out a terrified whimper. Mom, what is happening? She cried, looking at Valerie. Why are the cards declining? Valerie could not answer her. She was staring at the payment terminal like it was a venomous snake. The smug, victorious queen who had banished me to the streets was gone. In her place sat a terrified, exposed fraud, who suddenly realized she could not even afford the glass of champagne she was holding. If you cannot provide a valid form of payment, Harrison said, raising his voice so the surrounding tables could hear the consequence. I am required to ask you and your guests to vacate the premises immediately. I locked my tablet screen and set it on the seat beside me. The physical reaction was better than I had ever imagined. The absolute, unadulterated terror washing over my father's face was a masterpiece. He was totally, completely exposed. He had no money, no power, and no venue. And the best part was, the night was just getting started. I had successfully dismantled their public image. Now it was time to head up to the penthouse, open the forensic audit, and tear their private lives down to the studs. The Maybach slipped seamlessly into the subterranean parking cavern of my residential high-rise, gliding to a halt in my reserved, climate-controlled bay. David opened my door with his usual practiced silence. I stepped out, leaving the chaos of the Grand Onyx Hotel entirely behind me. The private express elevator required a retinal scan before the doors even opened, securing my ascent to the top floor. When the heavy steel doors parted, I stepped into my absolute sanctuary. My penthouse spanned the entire top floor, a sprawling expanse of imported dark oak brushed steel and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. It was the physical manifestation of 17 years of relentless, back-breaking work. The air up here was thin, quiet, and completely free of my family's toxic dysfunction. I walked directly to the massive marble kitchen island, dropping my clutch onto the counter. I kicked off my black heels, feeling the cool, polished stone beneath my bare feet. Reaching for a bottle of vintage Cabernet Sauvignon I had opened the night before, I poured myself a generous glass. The dark red liquid caught the ambient city light filtering through the windows. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The taste was rich, grounded, and victorious. I carried the glass over to my home office space, a sleek, minimalist setup dominated by a dual-monitor encrypted terminal. I sat down in the leather executive chair, tapped the keyboard, and placed my thumb on the biometric scanner. The screens flared to life instantly. Right in the center of my desktop was the secure file Elijah had transmitted. It was labeled with a simple, unassuming string of numbers, but I knew exactly what it contained. This was the forensic audit of Valerie's beloved charity, the Atlanta Vanguard Women's Initiative. For the past 5 years, Valerie had used this foundation to cement her status among the city elite. She hosted luncheons, secured front-page spreads in regional lifestyle magazines, and rubbed elbows with mayors and senators, all under the guise of empowering marginalized communities. Winston had leveraged his remaining business contacts to funnel massive corporate donations into the charity, completely convinced it was elevating his public profile. I clicked the file open. The decryption protocol ran for a few seconds before the master ledger populated across my dual monitors. I leaned back, taking another sip of wine, fully expecting to roll my eyes at a catalog of upper-class grift. I anticipated finding $50,000 floral arrangements billed as event expenses. I expected to see private jets chartered for supposed networking retreats to Aspen and lavish spa weekends disguised as wellness seminars. I was ready to look at a pathetic, predictable trail of vanity spending by a woman desperate to prove she was born into money rather than marrying into it. But as my eyes scanned the highlighted discrepancies marked by Elijah's forensic accounting team, the slight smirk on my face vanished. The air in the penthouse seemed to chill. I sat forward, setting my wine glass down with a sharp clink against the desk. This was not vanity spending. This was not a bored housewife skimming a few $1,000s off the top to buy a new designer bag. This was a massive, highly coordinated criminal black hole. I began scrolling through the line items, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm of absolute disbelief. The numbers staring back at me were staggering. Millions of dollars in supposed charitable donations had been systematically diverted over the past 3 years. Elijah's team had color-coded the outgoing wire transfers. According to the public tax filings, these funds were designated for community outreach programs, local orphanages, and business grants for underprivileged women. But the audit revealed the undeniable truth. The money never reached a single community center. It never funded a single scholarship. The entire foundation was a complete and utter sham. I opened the vendor payment logs, cross-referencing the recipients. Hundreds of massive wire transfers, some exceeding $200,000 at a time, were being funneled into three primary vendor accounts. The invoices claimed these payments were for logistical consulting, venue management, and program development. I ran a quick background query on the three vendors. None of them had physical addresses. None of them had active employee rosters. They were just post office boxes registered in Delaware. They were ghost ships, fabricated entities designed for one singular purpose. They existed solely to absorb millions in tax-deductible donations and launder the capital clean. Valerie was not just a gold digger draining my father's bank accounts. She was an active, willing participant in federal wire fraud. The realization hit me with stunning clarity. This explained exactly why Winston went bankrupt so rapidly. He was not just losing money to aggressive market shifts or bad real estate deals. His own wife was quietly siphoning the remaining liquid capital right out from under him, funneling his business partner's donations directly into a fraudulent abyss. I stared at the screen, tracing the digital signatures on the approval forms. Valerie had signed off on every single fraudulent invoice. Her name was all over the outgoing transfers. But as I scrutinized the sophisticated layering of the shell companies, a glaring inconsistency became obvious. Valerie was incredibly manipulative, but she was not financially literate. She could barely balance a standard checking account without complaining about the math. She certainly did not possess the technical acumen required to establish an untraceable network of offshore shell corporations and dummy holding companies in Delaware. She did not know how to layer international wire transfers to evade federal detection algorithms. Someone else had built this financial labyrinth. Someone with a background in corporate finance, a profound lack of ethics, and direct access to Valerie's inner circle. Someone who walked around charity galas, swirling scotch and bragging about his non-existent investors. I pulled up the corporate registration details for the primary shell company absorbing the funds. I needed to see exactly who Valerie was feeding. I needed to see the architect of this fraud. I ran a reverse lookup on the Delaware registration. The digital architecture was intentionally convoluted, designed to exhaust any standard auditor who might come poking around. The domestic post office box forwarded all legal correspondence to a registered agent firm in Panama, which then routed its financial directives to a primary holding entity located in the Cayman Islands. Apex Holdings. It was a classic offshore shell game, a textbook maneuver for hiding illicit wealth. But Elijah's forensic team was not a group of standard auditors. They were digital bloodhounds. They had bypassed the Cayman Wall entirely and tracked the active routing numbers directly to a private wealth management institution in Zurich. I clicked on the attached PDF containing the original banking charter for the offshore account. The document loaded onto my secondary monitor, displaying the primary beneficiary information. I zoomed in on the final page. Staring back at me was a bold, sloppy signature I recognized instantly. Preston. My arrogant, condescending brother-in-law, the man who had stood inches from my face just hours ago, swirling a glass of top-shelf scotch, claiming that my presence was disturbing his high-net-worth investors. He had looked down his nose at me, calling my business cheap. Preston did not have any investors. He was not managing a private equity portfolio. The entire persona he projected to the world, the bespoke suits, the luxury watches, the smug financial jargon he threw around at family dinners, was an absolute spectacular fabrication. I opened a new search terminal and utilized my high-clearance access to run a deep dive into Preston's personal financial history. I wanted to see the exact nature of the beast I was dealing with. The data populated instantly, and the reality of my golden brother-in-law was pathetic. Preston was not a titan of Wall Street. He had been quietly terminated from his mid-level investment firm 2 years ago for unauthorized and highly reckless trading. He had been unemployed ever since. To maintain the illusion of his wealth and keep his demanding wife happy, Preston had turned to aggressive day trading using heavily leveraged margin accounts. He was making massive unhedged bets on highly volatile markets, and he was losing catastrophically. The credit reports showed a man drowning in a financial abyss. Preston was millions of dollars in the red. The banks were not just calling him, they were circling him like sharks. He was facing total liquidation, asset seizure, and absolute public ruin. That was where my stepmother came in. I pulled up the charity disbursement logs and placed them side by side with Preston's margin call deadlines. The dates lined up perfectly. It was a rhythmic, symbiotic dance of federal crime. Every time Preston's brokers threatened to liquidate his positions and expose his insolvency, Valerie miraculously approved a massive grant for community development or a logistics retainer for Apex Holdings. She was bleeding the Atlanta Vanguard Women's Initiative completely dry to cover his gambling debts. She was signing off on wire transfers that drained funds meant for domestic violence shelters and pediatric clinics, sending that money directly into Preston's offshore black hole. I sat back in my leather chair, taking a slow breath as I processed the sheer, unbelievable audacity of the scheme. Why would Valerie risk federal prison for a son-in-law she barely tolerated? The answer was rooted in the exact same toxic vanity that drove her to throw me out of the gala. Valerie was obsessed with the aesthetic of perfection. She needed the women at her country club to envy her. She needed the world to look at Chloe and see a woman who had married into extraordinary, limitless wealth. If the truth about Preston came out, if the city found out that Chloe was married to an unemployed, broke, reckless gambler who was facing foreclosure, the humiliation would have destroyed Valerie. The social fallout would have been fatal to her fragile ego. To Valerie, stealing millions of dollars from a federally recognized charity was a perfectly acceptable price to pay to avoid the embarrassment of a flawed family image. She sacrificed her husband's business partners, her own legal safety, and the livelihoods of actual people in need just to ensure Chloe could keep pulling up to luxury boutiques in an imported sports car. I tracked the specific flow of the most recent transactions, my disgust crystallizing into a razor-sharp focus. Just last month, the charity had received a $250,000 donation designated specifically for a local youth center. The logs showed Valerie authorized a wire transfer for that exact amount to Apex Holdings exactly 2 days later. The stated purpose was operational consulting. I pulled up Chloe's social media account on my phone. I scrolled back to the exact same week. There was a photo of Chloe and Preston at an exclusive rooftop restaurant celebrating their anniversary. Chloe was beaming at the camera, showing off a massive custom diamond necklace. The caption praised her incredible hardworking husband for spoiling her. She was wearing the youth center around her neck. It was the exact same diamond necklace she had been clutching tonight when she sighed and called me an embarrassment to the family. The hypocrisy was so thick it was almost suffocating. They had looked at me, a woman who had built a legitimate empire through blood, sweat, and sleepless nights, and decided I was too low class for their ballroom. Meanwhile, they were essentially running a criminal syndicate disguised as a family unit. They were funding their entire existence with stolen money, sipping stolen champagne, and driving stolen cars. Preston thought he was a mastermind. He thought he had found the perfect, gullible mark in Valerie. He knew she would do absolutely anything to protect Chloe's social standing, so he weaponized her vanity and turned her into his personal ATM. He manipulated her into committing federal wire fraud, completely convinced that their wealthy facade would protect them from any real scrutiny. But Preston was sloppy. The offshore routing numbers, the IP addresses used to initiate the transfers, the digital timestamps linking the charity accounts directly to his Cayman Island holding company. It was all sitting right here on my desk. Elijah's team had packaged the evidence so perfectly that a first-year law student could have successfully prosecuted the case. I finished my glass of wine, the rich taste providing a stark contrast to the absolute filth I was reviewing on my screens. I had enough evidence right now to send Preston to a federal penitentiary for a very long time. I had enough proof to ensure Valerie would be trading her custom emerald gowns for a standard issue jumpsuit, but the puzzle was not completely solved yet. There was still one massive, glaring question hanging over the ledgers. Valerie was vain and Preston was desperate, but neither of them was brave enough to operate a fraud of this magnitude without an insurance policy. They knew that if Winston ever ordered an independent audit, or if the Internal Revenue Service selected the foundation for a random review, the entire scheme would collapse instantly. They needed a firewall. They needed someone to take the blame if the music ever stopped. I clicked into the foundational tax filings and the liability declarations for the charity. I needed to see exactly how they planned to explain the missing millions to the federal government. I needed to see who they had designated to take the fall. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I accessed the restricted federal tax forms for the past 3 fiscal years. The decryption software hummed, rendering the high-resolution images of the charity filings directly onto my screen. I pulled up the primary corporate liability declarations, the sworn legal documents submitted to the Internal Revenue Service under penalty of perjury. I scrolled past the revenue claims and the fabricated expense reports. I bypassed the board of directors, listing where Valerie proudly displayed her title as president. I stopped breathing. The air in my penthouse completely vanished. Right there on page 4, under the sworn declaration of operational liability, was my name. Imani Grant was listed in bold black text as the Chief Operations Officer and Lead Event Coordinator for the Atlanta Vanguard Women's Initiative. I stared at the digital document, my mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of what I was looking at. Directly beneath my printed name was a signature. It was not a clumsy, rushed fake. It was an absolute masterpiece of forgery. Valerie had taken the time to study my handwriting. She had meticulously copied the specific loop of the letters and the sharp slant of my signature from old birthday cards I used to send her in my early 20s before I cut them out of my personal life. She had perfectly replicated the way I signed my name, but it did not stop at the signature. I opened the vendor authorization logs. Every single fraudulent invoice paid to Preston's offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands had my forged initials stamped next to the approval line. Every bloated catering receipt, every fake consulting fee, and every massive wire transfer designed to cover Preston's catastrophic gambling debts had been legally authorized by me. To make the lie bulletproof, Valerie had dug into Winston's old tax records and extracted my highly confidential personal information. My social security number, my previous permanent address, and my date of birth were all officially registered with the federal government as the primary operational contact for the charity. According to the federal database, Valerie was just a wealthy, well-meaning figurehead who fundraised for the organization. I was the one running the day-to-day operations. I was the one executing the contracts. I was the one writing off millions of dollars in stolen funds as logistical expenses. They had used my actual real-world competence against me. They knew I ran a highly successful event planning and hospitality business. If any bank or government auditor ever looked into the foundation, seeing my name as the lead event coordinator would make perfect logical sense. It provided the ultimate cover story. The motive was so deeply sinister it made my blood run cold. If the authorities ever raided the charity, Valerie would simply play the victim. She would cry in front of the cameras, dabbing her eyes with a designer tissue, claiming she had placed too much trust in her estranged stepdaughter. Preston would remain a complete ghost, hidden safely behind his international firewall. Winston would claim ignorance. I would be the one taking the fall. I would be the one dragged out of my home in handcuffs. I would be the one facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary for racketeering, embezzlement, and aggravated identity theft. The events of the evening suddenly snapped into a terrifying crystal-clear focus. The encounter at the Grand Onyx Hotel replayed in my mind, but this time the audio track was entirely different. Throwing me out of the gala had absolutely nothing to do with my simple black dress. It had nothing to do with Chloe's delicate social sensibilities or Valerie's desire to maintain a pristine high society aesthetic. It was a desperate, highly calculated act of self-preservation. I had walked right into the epicenter of their active crime scene. If I had stayed in that ballroom, if I had mingled with the wealthy donors and local politicians, someone would have inevitably recognized my name from the charity brochures. Someone would have approached me, shaken my hand, and asked me about my role as the Chief Operations Officer. If I had introduced myself as a guest and handed out my actual corporate business card, the entire illusion would have shattered in seconds. The donors would have realized the woman allegedly managing their millions had no idea what they were talking about. Preston stepped into my personal space and demanded I leave because he was absolutely terrified. when he swirled his scotch and told me I was cheapening the brand he was sweating. Valerie ordered the armed security guards to grab me because I was a live grenade sitting in the middle of their massive fraud. They needed their designated fall guy off the premises immediately before I accidentally blew up their entire operation. The sheer breathtaking sociopathy of it took my breath away. They did not just view me as a disappointment or a social liability. They viewed me as a human shield. They were perfectly content to let me rot in a federal cell so Chloe could keep driving her imported sports cars and Preston could keep pretending to be a Wall Street titan. Winston had looked me in the eye in the hotel foyer, offered me a few $100s to go away, completely aware that his wife was using my identity to launder stolen money. The lingering shock evaporated, replaced by a cold, highly concentrated fury. I was no longer dealing with toxic relatives. I was dealing with a criminal syndicate that had just tried to murder my future. I closed the tax forms and exported the entire unredacted audit directly to a secure encrypted flash drive. I picked up my phone and dialed Elijah. The line connected instantly. "Did you see it?" Elijah asked, his voice tighter and sharper than usual. "They forged my signature," I said, my voice eerily calm. "They made me the chief operations officer. They attached my social security number to Preston's offshore transfers. We caught it during the final forensic sweep," Elijah confirmed. "It is textbook aggravated identity theft and federal wire fraud. Imani, they were going to feed you to the wolves. They built the entire structure to ensure you took the maximum legal penalty if the accounts were ever audited." I stood up from my desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the glittering expanse of the city. "Package the entire file," I commanded. "Every routing number, every forged signature, every falsified tax return, and every digital timestamp linking Valerie's computer to Preston's Cayman Island accounts. I want this sent directly to your contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Do it right now." "It is already done," Elijah replied smoothly. "The digital dossier was securely transmitted to the White Collar Crime Division 5 minutes ago. The federal trap is completely sealed. You are entirely insulated and they are thoroughly exposed." "Good," I said. And Imani, Elijah added a note of grim satisfaction entering his voice. "The general manager at the hotel just ran the corporate cards. The account's hard declined. The sponsorship waiver is officially void. The explosion has officially begun." "I will be waiting," I replied and ended the call. I walked back to the kitchen island and picked up my glass of wine. I had spent 17 years building an empire from the dirt they left me in. They thought they could use my name to fund their fake royalty. They thought I was just a naive girl they could sacrifice to protect their vanity. They were about to learn that when you try to sacrifice a queen, you better make sure you actually own the board. I tapped the screen of my tablet, expanding the live security feed from camera 4 to fill both high-definition monitors on my desk. I poured myself another glass of wine and settled deep into my leather executive chair. The digital theater of their destruction was broadcasting in brilliant clarity, and I did not want to miss a single frame of the collapse. Winston was no longer maintaining his posture of the proud patriarch. His tailored tuxedo jacket was unbuttoned, and a visible sheen of sweat coated his forehead, catching the glare of the ballroom chandeliers. He was furiously digging through his designer wallet, his hands trembling as he pulled out every corporate and personal credit card he possessed. One by one, he slapped the plastic rectangles onto the silk tablecloth. One by one, Harrison, the general manager of the Grand Onyx Hotel, picked them up and fed them into the mobile payment terminal. The aggressive, high-pitched beep of the terminal declining the transactions echoed through my localized audio feed. It was a rhythmic, relentless soundtrack of their financial ruin. Beep, declined. Beep, declined. Beep, declined. With every rejected card, the panic at the VIP table multiplied exponentially. The two wealthy investors seated across from Preston were not fools. These were men who managed actual equity portfolios, men who could smell insolvency from a mile away. They watched Winston fumble with his empty wallet in real time. They heard Harrison state clearly that the primary accounts were frozen due to a total loss of collateral. The older of the two investors set his crystal Scotch glass down on the table with a sharp, definitive clink. He did not say a word to my brother-in-law. He simply stood up, buttoned his tailored suit jacket, and gave Preston a look of absolute unadulterated disgust. The second investor immediately followed suit. Preston jumped up, his face flushed an ugly blotchy shade of crimson. He reached out desperately, trying to grab the older investor's arm, stammering out pathetic rapid-fire excuses about banking errors and temporary technical glitches. The investor swatted Preston's hand away, as if brushing off a diseased insect. They turned their backs on him without a second glance and walked directly out of the ballroom. Preston's entire fraudulent persona collapsed right there on the patterned carpet. He was exposed as a desperate broke grifter playing dress-up with his father-in-law's non-existent money. He stumbled back into his chair, his hands gripping his hair, realizing his offshore shell game was no longer enough to save his local reputation. Harrison did not break eye contact with Winston. The general manager raised his hand and gave a sharp, definitive nod to the catering captain standing near the kitchen double doors. The response was immediate and devastating. The elite hospitality staff of the Grand Onyx Hotel did not cause a chaotic scene. They operated with ruthless, militant efficiency. Dozens of waiters and busboys emerged from the kitchen, carrying large stainless steel clearing carts. They marched straight past the bewildered high society guests and began dismantling the buffet stations mid-service. Valerie let out a shrill, strangled gasp, her hands flying to her face. She watched in absolute horror as two waiters approached her VIP table and unceremoniously whisked away the towering silver platter of imported lobster tails and fresh oysters. They did not apologize. They did not ask for permission. They simply repossessed the unpaid inventory right out from under her nose. Across the ballroom, the elite guests of the Atlanta Vanguard Women's Initiative watched the lavish feast vanish into the service corridors. The whispers started instantly. Wealthy socialites leaned into each other, their eyes darting toward Valerie's table behind shielded hands. The prestigious, exclusive charity gala had transformed into a spectacular, highly public repossession event. Then came the final atmospheric insult. The jazz band on the main stage stopped playing mid-song, the abrupt silence feeling heavier than the music. The musicians began placing their brass instruments back into their velvet-lined cases. The warm, ambient golden lighting that Valerie had spent weeks obsessing over was abruptly cut off. The hotel engineering staff flipped the main breakers, flooding the entire ballroom with bright, unforgiving industrial house lights. The sudden brightness stripped away every last ounce of romance and luxury from the room. It exposed the cheap, frantic panic on Valerie's face. It highlighted the nervous sweat stains blooming under Preston's arms. It revealed the absolute total devastation of Winston Grant. They looked incredibly small and insignificant standing under the harsh fluorescent glare. Harrison stood tall at the head of their table, his posture immaculate and his tone unyielding. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the newly silent room, "as you are unable to provide a valid form of payment, I must ask you and your immediate party to vacate the property right now. If you do not comply, I will instruct my security team to escort you out for theft of services." Winston looked around the brightly lit room. He saw the city's most powerful politicians, real estate developers, and social influencers staring directly at him. He saw the whispers, the pointed fingers, the undeniable absolute judgment of the peers he had spent his entire life trying to impress. He had no power here. He had no leverage. He was completely, irrevocably broke. He grabbed Valerie by the arm, his grip harsh and desperate. "We are leaving!" He barked, his voice cracking under the weight of his humiliation. Chloe began to sob openly, her face buried in her trembling hands, the massive diamond necklace glittering mockingly under the bright lights. Preston trailed behind them, looking like a man walking directly to the gallows. The four of them began the longest, most agonizing walk of their entire lives. They had to cross the entire length of the sprawling ballroom, navigating through the sea of guests they had tried so desperately to command. The crowd actively parted for them, socialites and executives stepping back quickly, as if failure and poverty were highly contagious diseases. No one offered a word of comfort. No one stepped forward to help. They were treated exactly like the pariahs they truly were. I watched them shuffle out of the grand double mahogany doors completely stripped of their dignity, their fake wealth, and their meticulously curated aesthetic. They had thrown me out just an hour ago to protect their flawless image. Now they were fleeing my building as the biggest laughingstock in Atlanta history. They thought the worst thing that could happen to them was losing their social standing in front of their wealthy friends. They thought being escorted out of a hotel was the ultimate punishment. They had absolutely no idea that the financial ruin they just experienced was merely the opening act. They did not know that the FBI White-Collar Crime Division was currently analyzing the forged tax documents they left behind, or that federal agents were already tracking Preston's Cayman Island routing numbers. I closed the security feed on my monitor and picked up my encrypted phone. The public execution was over. The private desperate fallout was about to begin. I set my encrypted tablet down and picked up my personal smartphone. It had been resting on the marble kitchen island, completely silent, on its restrictive setting, while I dismantled their lives from the safety of my penthouse. The moment I disabled the privacy lock, the device practically convulsed in my hand. The haptic feedback buzzed with such violent frequency that the phone threatened to vibrate right off the polished stone counter. The notification counter spun like a slot machine hitting the ultimate jackpot. 10 missed calls, 30 missed calls, 67 missed calls. The screen flashed relentlessly with incoming alerts, a digital avalanche of sheer, unadulterated panic. I leaned against the counter, took a slow, deliberate sip of my Cabernet, and watched their entire world burn through a 5-inch screen. Winston was the first to breach the silence. His initial texts were full of his typical arrogant bluster, typed in frantic, disjointed bursts. "Imani, call your bank right now. There is a catastrophic error with our corporate accounts at the hotel. Fix this immediately." 2 minutes later, the tone shifted. Harrison, the general manager, had clearly given him the name of the trust. "Imani Harrison is saying Onyx Holdings revoked our waiver. He says you are the primary trustee. Pick up the phone. This is not funny. People are staring at us." Then came Valerie. Her messages were a jarring whiplash from the woman who had snapped her manicured fingers in my face just an hour ago. "Imani, please, you have to help us. They are taking the food away. The cards are declining. The investors are leaving. Fix this right now. We are family." Family. The word looked absolutely pathetic glowing on my screen. She only remembered we were related when her credit limit hit 0. She only claimed me as blood when she was publicly bleeding out in front of the Atlanta elite. Chloe's messages were pure spoiled hysteria. "My friends are leaving. Everyone is laughing at us. Mom is crying in the lobby. Do something, Imani, you owe us." I traced the rim of my wine glass, feeling a deep, resonating calm wash over me. I owed them absolutely nothing. I had paid my dues in full the day Winston let Valerie drain my biological mother's savings account to buy Chloe a graduation sports car. I had paid my dues when I worked 3 jobs exhausted and alone while they paraded around the city pretending to be royalty. But the most satisfying messages, the ones that truly captured the gravity of the execution, came from Preston. His texts did not start with demands or arrogant commands. They started with raw, unfiltered terror. "Imani, my offshore login is completely locked. The Cayman portal says the assets are seized by a federal mandate. Did you do this?" A few minutes later, as he realized the true magnitude of his exposure, the messages became frantic, breathless pleas. "Imani, the bank is saying the FBI flagged the routing numbers. They know about the charity transfers. They know about the tax documents. You have to tell them it was a mistake. I will go to prison. Help me, please. Pick up the phone." Preston thought he was the smartest man in the room. He thought he could use my identity as a human shield pin, his massive financial crimes on the discarded stepchild, and walk away a rich man. Now he was staring down the barrel of a federal indictment, begging the very woman he tried to frame for a lifeline. He was suffocating in the trap he had dug for me. My phone vibrated aggressively in my palm. An incoming call from Winston illuminated the display. I did not answer. I swiped the red icon, declining the call and sending him straight to voicemail. I wanted them to sit in the suffocating silence. I wanted them to experience the exact same crushing isolation I had felt at 18, standing on the pavement with my empty college acceptance letters while they celebrated their stolen wealth. The phone rang again, Valerie this time. I declined it. Then Chloe declined. They were spiraling. The reality of their situation was crashing down on them in real time. They could not go back to Winston's corporate headquarters. My security team had already locked the doors and changed the access codes. They could not go to their favorite high-end restaurants to regroup and form a plan. Their platinum cards were useless plastic. They could not even check into a hotel room to hide their faces from the public. They were entirely boxed in, trapped in a city that only respected the money they no longer had. A new text notification chimed, cutting through the barrage of missed calls. This one was from Elijah. They just tried to access the residential gates at Winston's primary estate, Elijah wrote. The security codes have been formally revoked due to the property transfer. The gate guards denied them entry. They are officially locked out of their own home. I read the message twice, letting the absolute finality of it settle in my bones. I had taken the ballroom. I had taken the bank accounts. I had taken the corporate headquarters. And now I had taken their home. The fortress of their vanity was firmly under my lock and key. Another message from Elijah immediately followed. My surveillance team is tracking their vehicle. They are in a standard rideshare. They just merged onto the highway heading north. They are coming to you. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling illuminated grid of the city. Down there somewhere in the chaotic flow of late-night traffic, my family was speeding toward my high-rise. They had exhausted every other option. They had called their wealthy friends, and those friends had ignored them. They had tried their banks, and the banks had turned them away. I was their absolute last resort. My phone lit up one more time. It was a text from Winston. The message was completely stripped of his usual pride, stripped of the booming, authoritative tone he had used to terrorize me my entire life. It was the message of a broken, desperate man who had finally realized he was entirely at my mercy. "We are coming to your penthouse," Winston wrote. "Please, Imani, please open the door, please." I set my empty wine glass down in the marble sink. I did not reply to his text. I simply walked over to the digital security panel mounted on my wall. I tapped the screen accessing the building's central control matrix. I authorized a one-time temporary bypass for the private elevator, granting them clearance to reach my floor. Let them come. The antique grandfather clock standing in the corner of my living room began to chime. The deep, resonant tones filled the sprawling penthouse, marking exactly midnight. Outside my floor-to-ceiling windows, the sprawling grid of Atlanta glittered with a cold, indifferent brilliance. The city was moving on totally unconcerned with the catastrophic collapse of Winston Grant. But up here in the insulated quiet of my sanctuary, the final act of their destruction was arriving right on schedule. A soft, electronic ping echoed from the security console mounted on my wall. It was the proximity alert for the private elevator. I had authorized the bypass, allowing the carriage to ascend past the lobby, past the residential tiers, and directly up to the penthouse level. The digital display tracked their ascent in real time. Floor 20, floor 30, floor 45. Every passing second was a physical manifestation of them being dragged up from the streets they thought they owned into the reality I actually controlled. The heavy steel doors of the private elevator slid open with a smooth mechanical hum. For exactly 3 seconds, there was absolute silence. Then the chaos erupted. The pounding started against my double mahogany doors. It was not a polite, hesitant knock. It was not the authoritative, demanding rap of a patriarch expecting immediate obedience. It was the frantic, aggressive, completely unhinged hammering of people who were actively drowning and looking for a piece of driftwood to cling to. The heavy wood shuddered under the force of multiple fists beating against it simultaneously. "Imani, open this door right now!" Winston shouted, his voice muffled through the thick, soundproofed barrier. "I know you are in there. The lobby guard said you bypassed the elevator. Open the door." Valerie joined in, her voice shrill and borderline hysterical. Imani, please, you have to let us in. We have been sitting in a rideshare for 40 minutes trying to figure this out. They locked us out of the neighborhood. The gates would not open. Open the door. I did not move toward the entryway. I stood perfectly still, my arms crossed, and tapped the wall console to bring up the exterior security camera feed. The high-definition full-color screen flickered to life, giving me a pristine, unobstructed view of the private hallway. The sight was nothing short of cinematic perfection. The untouchable elite family that had just banished me from their $5,000 a plate gala looked completely ravaged. The swift, brutal reality of poverty had aged them 10 years in the span of a single hour. Winston was leaning heavily against the wall, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. He had discarded his tailored tuxedo jacket somewhere between the hotel and my building. His bow tie was undone, hanging loosely around his neck, and his crisp white shirt was soaked with sweat. He looked utterly defeated, a broken man who had just realized his entire legacy was a mirage funded by the daughter he threw away. Valerie was pacing the narrow hallway like a trapped animal. The emerald green designer gown she had proudly paraded around the ballroom now looked wrinkled and out of place. The flawless camera-ready makeup she had meticulously applied was entirely ruined, smeared across her cheeks in dark, jagged tracks of mascara and eyeliner. She kept frantically pulling at the handle of my locked door, completely stripped of her high society dignity. Chloe was slumped against the opposite wall, sitting directly on the floor. The golden child, the woman who had dramatically adjusted her diamonds and complained that my presence ruined her aesthetic, was openly hyperventilating. She had kicked off her expensive heels and pulled her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth. The illusion of her perfect, privileged life had been violently ripped away, and she lacked the fundamental resilience to process the exposure. But it was Preston who commanded my attention on the monitor. My arrogant, condescending brother-in-law was pacing in tight, erratic circles behind Winston. The smug finance bro who had sneered at my business cards and mocked my lifestyle was practically vibrating with terror. His face was a sickly shade of gray. He was sweating so profusely his tuxedo shirt clung to his skin. He kept checking his phone, refreshing the screen over and over again, desperately hoping his offshore accounts would miraculously unlock. He knew exactly what was coming for him. He knew the federal net was tightening around his neck with every passing second. I watched them via the security feed, letting the silence of my penthouse stretch on. I wanted them to sit in the panic. I wanted the cold, harsh reality of the hallway to break whatever remaining delusions they held on to. The tension outside the door finally hit a breaking point. The glue that held their picture-perfect family together was not loyalty, and it was certainly not love. It was direct deposit, and the moment that money vanished, they turned on each other with breathtaking speed. "This is your fault," Preston snapped suddenly, stopping his frantic pacing and pointing an accusing finger at Winston. "You told us those corporate debts were handled. You told us a foreign group bought the land. How could you not know your own daughter was the one holding the mortgage? You let us walk right into a slaughterhouse. Do not you dare raise your voice to me in this hallway!" Winston roared back, his lingering pride momentarily overriding his exhaustion. "I provided for you. I put a roof over your head and funded your entire lifestyle. You are living off my name. Your name is completely worthless!" Preston shouted, the sheer terror of his impending federal indictment stripping away his false respect. The hotel manager laughed in your face. "The bank flagged your accounts for zero collateral. You do not own anything. You are a broke, incompetent old man who just dragged my entire portfolio down with him." Valerie spun around, abandoning my door to intervene. "Do not speak to my husband that way," she screamed, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at Preston. "We gave you everything. I trusted you with the charity accounts. You promised me those investments would generate massive returns for Chloe's future." Preston let out a dark, unhinged laugh that bordered on a sob. "You think this is about Chloe's future? Valerie, the FBI is freezing my accounts. The Cayman Holding Company is locked down. Imani knows about the wire transfers." Winston froze. The color drained from his face as he looked from Preston to Valerie. "What wire transfers? What the hell are you talking about?" Valerie shrank back against my door, her eyes darting away from her husband. "Winston, It was just a temporary strategy. Preston needed liquidity for a margin call, and the charity had surplus funds. We were going to put it back before the quarterly audit. You stole from the foundation, Winston asked, his voice dropping to a horrified whisper. You used the charity money to cover his gambling debts. Are you out of your mind? Do you realize the federal exposure that brings to this family? We used Imani's name. Valerie blurted out, her survival instinct overriding any shred of decency. We put her down as the operations officer on the tax forms. We forged her signature. If the feds come looking, the paper trail points directly to her, not us. We are protected. We just need her to open this door and transfer the hotel funds so we can cover the missing capital before the authorities look too closely. Winston stared at his wife, completely appalled. He was a proud, flawed man who made terrible business decisions, but even he seemed entirely unprepared for the depth of his wife's criminality. You tried to frame my daughter for federal embezzlement? He whispered. Chloe buried her face in her hands, sobbing louder. We are going to prison. We are all going to prison. I listened to their complete structural collapse through the high-definition audio feed. They were cannibalizing each other right on my doorstep. Valerie actually believed that her forged documents would protect her. She fundamentally misunderstood the power dynamic. She thought she had built a clever trap, completely unaware that I had already handed the blueprint of her crimes to the authorities. Footsteps approached from behind me. I did not need to turn around to know it was Elijah. He had arrived via the secondary security elevator flanked by two armed elite private security contractors. He stood silently at my shoulder, looking at the security monitor. He held a thick, heavy manila folder in his hands. It contained every bank statement, every offshore routing number, and the fully unredacted forensic audit. They are tearing each other apart, Elijah observed, his voice devoid of any sympathy. They are functioning exactly as designed, I corrected him. Are you ready to deliver the final verdict? He asked, adjusting his suit jacket. I took a slow, deep breath, centering myself in the absolute authority of the moment. 17 years of gaslighting, financial abuse, and emotional manipulation had led to this exact doorway. The father who told me to hustle in the mud was currently wiping sweat from his brow in my hallway. The stepmother who snapped her fingers and ordered security to throw me out was begging for access to my sanctuary. I reached out and placed my hand on the heavy brass deadbolt of my double mahogany doors. I am ready, I said. I turned the heavy brass deadbolt. The lock disengaged with a loud final click that echoed through the vast expanse of my foyer. I grasped the handles of the double mahogany doors and pulled them open in one smooth, sweeping motion. The frantic screaming in the hallway died instantly. Winston, Valerie, Chloe, and Preston froze, their eyes widening as they took in the scene before them. I did not stand alone. I stood perfectly centered in the grand entryway, flanked by Elijah and two elite armed security contractors, whose sheer physical presence commanded absolute immediate compliance. The bright, warm lighting of my penthouse spilled out into the dim corridor, illuminating the absolute wreckage of my so-called family. Valerie was the first to break the stunned silence. The vicious, calculating woman who had actively plotted to send me to federal prison suddenly transformed into a weeping, fragile victim. She lunged forward, tears streaming down her ruined makeup, reaching her hands out toward me in a desperate plea for salvation. Imani, thank God, she cried, her voice cracking with forced desperation. Please let us inside. It is a nightmare out here. We are family. We have to stick together and fix this massive misunderstanding. You have to call the bank and tell them to restore our access right now. I did not blink. I did not move a single inch to welcome her. One of my security guards took a deliberate half-step forward, placing his imposing frame directly between Valerie's outstretched hands and my personal space. She gasped and recoiled, stumbling backward until she bumped into Winston's chest. Winston tried to muster the deep, booming voice he had used to intimidate me for 35 years. It came out ragged, weak, and entirely unconvincing. Imani, call off your men. We need to come inside your apartment right now and handle this private family matter behind closed doors. You have made your point tonight. You got your revenge. Now unlock the accounts before the media gets wind of this and ruins us all. Before I could even address my father's pathetic attempt at giving orders in my building, Preston pushed his way to the front of the group. The absolute panic sweating out of his pores briefly morphed into the arrogant entitlement of a finance bro who was used to bullying his way out of consequences. He puffed out his chest, squaring his shoulders as he glared at me, trying to project a dominance he completely lacked. "Listen to me very carefully," Preston demanded, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "You think you can just hijack a corporate network and freeze my assets? You are playing with fire. If you do not reverse the hold on the Cayman accounts right now, I will drag you through the courts for financial sabotage. I will ruin your entire life." I looked at his shaking finger, then moved my gaze up to his bloodshot, terrified eyes. I did not need to say a single word. I simply tilted my head toward Elijah. Elijah stepped past me, his tailored suit cutting a sharp, lethal silhouette against the warm glow of the penthouse foyer. He held the thick, heavy manila folder in his right hand. He did not offer it to Preston. He did not hand it to Winston to review. He held it out over the marble threshold and simply let go. The folder hit the floor with a loud, resounding slap. The clasp broke open upon impact. Hundreds of pages spilled out across the polished stone, scattering directly over Preston's expensive leather shoes. Apex Holdings. Elijah stated, his voice resonating with lethal corporate authority. $3 million actively diverted from the Atlanta Vanguard Women's Initiative. We have the offshore routing numbers. We have the domestic wire transfer approvals authorized by Valerie Grant. And most importantly, we have the federal tax declarations featuring a meticulously forged signature designed to frame my client for your embezzlement. Preston looked down at the documents scattered across the floor. He recognized the bank logos. He saw the highlighted Cayman Island account numbers and the exact timestamps of his fraudulent transfers. All the fake bravado he had just mustered evaporated into thin air. His knees actually buckled slightly, and he had to grab the doorframe to keep from collapsing onto the scattered evidence. Chloe stared at the papers on the floor, her eyes darting from Preston's terrified face to the documents confirming her husband was a massive fraud. She let out a quiet, horrified gasp, pressing her hands against her mouth as the crushing reality of her impending poverty finally set in. Valerie tried one last desperate maneuver to save herself. "Imani, we did not mean for it to go this far," she pleaded, her voice shrinking under Elijah's intense glare. "Preston said it was just a temporary reallocation of capital. We were going to put the money back before the end of the fiscal year. We used your name to protect the family from unnecessary audits. You have to understand, we were just trying to keep our legacy intact." "You used my name to build a firewall for your federal crimes," I said, my voice cutting through the hallway air like shattered glass. "You drained my biological mother's savings to buy a sports car, and then you tried to steal my freedom to cover a catastrophic gambling debt. You do not have a legacy, Valerie. You have a crime syndicate that just ran out of funding." Preston dropped to his knees right there in the hallway. He frantically began gathering the scattered papers, his hands shaking so violently he tore several pages in the process. "You cannot show these to anyone," he stammered, looking up at me with sheer, unadulterated terror in his eyes. "Imani, please, I will pay it all back. I will find a way. Just do not send this to the authorities. They will lock me away for decades." Elijah looked down at the pathetic man scrambling on the floor. "You are holding copies," Elijah informed him coldly. "The originals, along with the complete digital footprint of the IP addresses used to forge the tax documents, were securely transmitted to the Federal Bureau of Investigation White Collar Crime Division 20 minutes ago. The freeze on your offshore accounts was not just a banking error, it was a federal mandate." The air was completely sucked out of the hallway. Winston let out a low, guttural groan, leaning his head back against the patterned wallpaper as the absolute certainty of his destruction settled over his shoulders. Winston slid down the expensive patterned wallpaper of the corridor, his legs giving out completely under the crushing weight of his reality. He landed on the floor right beside Preston, his tailored trousers pooling around his knees. The two supposedly powerful men, the titans of Atlanta high society, who had just patronized me in a glittering ballroom, were now reduced to groveling on my marble threshold. Valerie saw her husband collapse and realized the financial firewall was truly gone. In a last desperate bid for survival, she tried to play her final card. She pushed past Preston and dropped to her knees, reaching her hands out toward me. Her face was a horrifying mask of smeared makeup in pure panic. "Imani, please listen to me," Valerie sobbed, her voice trembling with manufactured affection. "We are family. I know we have had our differences, but I practically raised you. We can sit down right now and figure out a payment plan. I will sell my jewelry. I will sell the cars. Just call your attorney off and stop the federal investigation. You cannot send your own family to a penitentiary." I looked down at the woman who had spent 17 years ensuring I felt like a worthless outsider in my own home. I remembered the countless times she had mocked my clothes, belittled my business, and paraded her biological daughter around like royalty bought with my dead mother's money. "You did not raise me, Valerie," I replied, my voice cutting through her pathetic tears like a surgical blade. "You simply occupied space in my father's house while I raised myself. You do not have any jewelry left to sell. Every diamond around your neck and every imported car in your garage was purchased using a fraudulent line of credit secured by my assets. Those items belong to the bank, and by extension they belong to me. You are leaving this building with absolutely nothing but the ruined dress on your back." Chloe let out a gut-wrenching wail from the corner of the hallway. She looked down at her hands, realizing that the designer rings on her fingers were essentially stolen property. "Mom, what are we going to do?" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking with the sheer terror of impending poverty. "My friends are going to find out. The country club is going to know. I do not even have a job. How am I supposed to survive?" "You should try hustling in the mud, Chloe," I suggested smoothly, not breaking my stoic expression. "I hear it builds excellent character." Winston pushed himself up onto his knees, his hands trembling as he crawled slightly forward across the scattered damning financial documents. The arrogant patriarch was completely gone. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot and brimming with panicked, desperate tears. He looked up at me, the daughter he had consistently failed, finally realizing that I was the only god in his universe who could grant him mercy. "Imani, please," Winston begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, broken sob. "I am your father. I gave you life. You cannot destroy your own blood like this. We can fix this mess. Just call the lawyers off and give us a chance to make it right. I am begging you, please remember that I am your father." I looked down at him. I did not yell. I did not cry. My heart rate did not even elevate. I stood there wrapped in the absolute power of a woman who had built herself from the ground up and spoke with ice-cold precision. "You threw me out because I did not fit your aesthetic." I stated, my voice echoing off the high ceilings of the corridor. "Now you do not fit my tax bracket. The 20 million is frozen. The FBI has Preston's routing numbers. You have 30 days to vacate my properties." Winston opened his mouth to protest, but the words died in his throat as the absolute finality of my statement washed over him. "That includes the corporate headquarters and the suburban estate you currently call home," I added, removing any lingering shred of hope they might have harbored. Winston reached a trembling hand out toward the hem of my black dress, practically weeping on my doorstep. "You cannot do this," he whimpered, completely shattered. "You are my daughter." I did not step back. I did not flinch. I looked him dead in the eye, feeling absolute zero emotion for the man kneeling before me. I channeled the exact same energy, the exact same devastating, arrogant dismissal that his wife had used against me in the grand ballroom just hours prior. "Security." I commanded, my voice sharp and unwavering. "Escort them out." The two elite guards moved instantly. They grabbed Winston by the arms and hauled him to his feet, marching him roughly toward the freight elevator. Preston scrambled to gather the remaining federal tax documents, but the second guard grabbed him by the collar of his ruined tuxedo and dragged him down the hall. Valerie and Chloe stumbled after them, their cries of protest and despair echoing loudly down the corridor as they realized their reign of terror was officially terminated. Elijah bent down calmly, collected the remaining financial evidence from the marble floor, and placed the documents back into the manila folder. He gave me a sharp, respectful nod, turned on his heel, and followed the security team to ensure the trash was properly taken out to the curb. I did not watch them step into the elevator. I did not need to see the doors close on their faces to know I had won. I simply stepped backward into my foyer, grabbed the heavy brass handles of my double mahogany doors and pulled them shut. The deadbolt clicked into place with a heavy, satisfying thud. The screaming in the hallway was instantly cut off. The panic, the toxicity, the exhausting generational trauma, it was all severed by a single slab of soundproof wood. The silence that filled my penthouse was not empty. It was heavy with victory, thick with the undeniable reality of my independence. I turned around and walked back into my magnificent, quiet living room. I walked over to the marble kitchen island, poured myself one final glass of wine, and moved toward the expansive windows. I looked out over the glittering Atlanta skyline, watching the tiny red taillights of the city traffic flowing through the streets below. They had tried to bury me in the mud, completely unaware that they were just giving me the foundation to build an impenetrable fortress. And tonight, I was leaving them in the dust, resting in absolute wealthy peace,